In the autumn of 1863, something unspeakable happened in the remote mountains of West Virginia that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. On what should have been the most joyous night of Martha Carver's wedding, 4 people died violently in a blood-soaked ritual that local authorities desperately tried to cover up for over a century and a half. The true details of that horrific September evening have remained buried in classified county records, sealed testimonies, and the traumatized whispers of a family that controlled one of the largest illegal arms operations during the Civil War. What you're about to hear challenges everything we thought we knew about the moral boundaries of American families during our nation's darkest hour. The Carver family's wedding night tradition wasn't just disturbing, it was deadly, and the evidence suggests similar rituals may have occurred across multiple states throughout the 1860s. Before we continue with the story of the 9 Carver siblings and their blood-soaked legacy, if you're fascinated by hidden American history and dark family secrets, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We dive deep into the most chilling true stories that textbooks won't tell you, and I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below telling us your state or city. Now, let's uncover the truth about what really happened in those West Virginia mountains. The Carver family compound sat like a fortress in the rugged hills of what is now Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Though in 1863, the region still bore the scars of recent statehood and violent division. The area had split from Virginia just months earlier, and the mountainous terrain provided perfect cover for the family's extensive smuggling operations. 9 siblings, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Caleb, Silas, Abraham, Martha, Rebecca, Judith, and young Sarah, controlled a network of hidden caves, mountain passes, and abandoned mining shafts that stretched across 3 state lines. The eldest, Ezekiel Carver, had inherited not just the family's sprawling timber business, but also its darker enterprises from their father Mari, who had died under suspicious circumstances in 1859. Local records describe Ezekiel as a man of imposing stature, with piercing gray eyes and a voice that could command absolute silence in any room. His brother Jeremiah, just 2 years younger, possessed a violent temperament that had earned him a reputation even among the rough mountain folk who asked few questions about a man's past. The Carver sisters were equally formidable in their own ways. Martha, at 28, had already buried 2 husbands in what authorities had ruled mining accidents. Rebecca, 26, managed the family's legitimate timber operations with an iron fist, while 4-year-old Judith oversaw their network of informants throughout the region. The youngest, Sarah, barely 19, possessed an unsettling intelligence that her siblings often used to their advantage in negotiations. Their mountain compound consisted of the main house, an imposing 3-story structure built from local stone, surrounded by numerous outbuildings that served various purposes in their criminal enterprise. What neighbors couldn't see were the extensive underground chambers carved into the mountainside where weapons, ammunition, and other contraband were stored before being sold to both Union and Confederate forces. The Carvers had no political loyalties. They sold death to whoever could pay their prices. The autumn of 1863 found the family at the height of their power and wealth. The Civil War had created an insatiable demand for weapons, and their strategic location along smuggling routes made them incredibly valuable to military suppliers on both sides. But with great profits came great risks, and the Carvers had developed increasingly paranoid methods to protect their secrets and eliminate potential threats to their operation. The wedding that would forever stain the Carver name began as a calculated business arrangement, as most marriages did in their world. Martha Carver was to marry Colonel Bradford Sinclair, a Confederate officer whose regiment controlled key supply routes through the Shenandoah Valley. Sinclair, a widower in his 40s, with graying temples and battle scars across his left cheek, possessed both the military connections and moral flexibility that made him valuable to the Carver enterprise. The courtship had been brief and purely transactional. Sinclair needed reliable weapon suppliers for his increasingly desperate regiment, while the Carvers sought military protection and insider information about Union troop movements. The marriage would cement their partnership and provide cover for their expanded operations throughout Virginia and the newly formed state of West Virginia. But Colonel Sinclair was not the only outsider invited to witness the Carver wedding ceremony. The family had also extended invitations to several other individuals whose presence that night would prove fatal. Among them was Thomas Hartwell, a federal arms inspector who had been secretly taking bribes from the Carvers in exchange for overlooking illegal weapons shipments. Hartwell, a nervous man with thinning hair and constantly trembling hands, believed he was attending merely as a family friend, unaware that his usefulness to the Carvers had recently expired. Also present was Dr. Marcus Finch, the family's personal physician and longtime keeper of their medical secrets. Finch had attended 2 numerous hunting accidents and riding mishaps that had befallen those who crossed the Carver family over the years. His medical bag contained not just traditional healing supplies, but also a variety of poisons, sedatives, and other substances that the family found useful in their line of work. The ceremony itself took place on September 23, 1863, in the main hall of the Carver compound. Local records show that Reverend Nathan Prescott, a mountain preacher known for his flexible interpretation of Christian doctrine, officiated the service. About 30 guests attended, though most were either family members, employees of the Carver enterprises, or individuals who owed the family various debts and favors. Martha wore her grandmother's wedding dress, a cream-cold silk gown that had been carefully preserved despite its age. Colonel Sinclair appeared in his dress uniform, his sword gleaming at his side, and his medals catching the light from the oil lamps that illuminated the ceremony. To outside observers, it seemed like any other mountain wedding, albeit one involving families of considerable wealth and influence. What the guests didn't know was that the Carvers had planned far more than a simple wedding celebration for that evening. As the evening progressed, and most guests departed, the true nature of the Carver family tradition began to reveal itself. The 9 siblings had maintained a secret ritual for over a decade, one that they claimed bound them together in unbreakable loyalty and shared purpose. This ritual, which they called the Sacred Covenant, was performed on significant family occasions, births, deaths, and most importantly, marriages. The remaining guests, Colonel Sinclair, Thomas Hartwell, Dr. Finch, and a handful of trusted family associates, were invited to participate in what Ezekiel described as an ancient mountain ceremony that would welcome the new family member and ensure his complete dedication to the Carver cause. The ritual was presented as a harmless folk tradition, something quaint and rustic that sophisticated outsiders might find amusing. In reality, the Sacred Covenant involved the consumption of a powerful mixture that Dr. Finch prepared according to a recipe that had been passed down through the family for generations. The concoction combined several ingredients: laudanum, a tincture of opium commonly used for pain relief, extracts from local mushrooms known to produce hallucinations, and various herbs that intensified the psychological effects. The Carvers called this mixture mountain wine, and they claimed it promoted spiritual bonding and revealed hidden truths about those who consumed it. The ritual took place in the family's private chamber beneath the main house, a stone-walled room lit by dozens of candles and decorated with symbols carved into the rock walls. These symbols, which local historians would later struggle to identify, appear to be a mixture of Celtic, Germanic, and Native American influences, reflecting the diverse heritage of the mountain families who had settled the region over the past century. As midnight approached, the participants gathered in a circle around a large wooden table, carved with intricate designs. Each person was given a silver cup containing the mountain wine, and Ezekiel began reciting what he claimed were ancient family vows of loyalty and secrecy. The words were spoken in a mixture of English and what sounded like German dialect, though later investigation would suggest that much of the ceremony was invented by the Carvers themselves. The effects of the drug mixture began to take hold within minutes. Participants reported feeling euphoric, detached from reality, and increasingly suggestible to the commands and suggestions of others. Time seemed to slow down, and the boundaries between individual consciousness began to blur. In this altered state, the Carvers revealed their true intentions for the evening, under the influence of their potent drug mixture. The sacred covenant ritual transformed from a seemingly harmless ceremony into something far more sinister. The Carvers used this altered state to extract confessions, test loyalties, and ensure complete submission from both family members and outsiders. What happened next in that underground chamber would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Ezekiel Carver began by demanding that each participant confess their deepest secrets and hidden betrayals. The drug made it nearly impossible to lie or withhold information, and one by one, the participants revealed information that the Carvers had long suspected, but never confirmed. Thomas Hartwell, the federal arms inspector, admitted under the influence that he had been providing information about Carver operations to Union intelligence officers in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Colonel Sinclair, Martha's new husband, revealed that his regiment had been ordered to investigate and potentially arrest the entire Carver family as enemy collaborators. His marriage to Martha was meant to gather evidence from the inside while maintaining his cover. Dr. Finch confessed that he had been documenting the family's crimes in a secret journal, planning to use the information as insurance against potential prosecution. But perhaps most shocking were the admissions from within the family itself. Under the drug's influence, several Carver siblings revealed long-held resentments, secret deals with competitors, and plans to betray one another for personal gain. The sacred covenant, which was supposed to strengthen family bonds, instead exposed the deep fractures and mutual distrust that existed among the 9 siblings. As these revelations emerged, the atmosphere in the underground chamber grew increasingly tense and paranoid. The drug amplified emotions and removed normal social inhibitions, creating a volatile mixture of rage, fear, and violent impulses. Jeremiah Carver, always the most unstable of the siblings, became fixated on the idea that they were surrounded by traitors and spies who needed to be eliminated immediately. The candlelit chamber, which had seemed mystical and ancient at the beginning of the ritual, now felt like a tomb. The carved symbols on the walls appeared to dance and shift in the flickering light, and the participants' drug-altered perceptions made every shadow seem threatening. The mountain wine had created a shared delusion of paranoia and violence that would soon explode into bloodshed. Ezekiel tried to maintain control over the deteriorating situation, but even he underestimated how powerfully the drug would affect both his siblings and their guests. What had begun as a calculated method of control was rapidly spiraling into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The violence began suddenly and without warning. Jeremiah Carver, his mind completely unhinged by the drug mixture and paranoid revelations, grabbed a heavy iron candlestick from the table and brought it down on Thomas Hartwell's skull with crushing force. The federal inspector collapsed instantly, blood pooling beneath his shattered head as his body convulsed in its death throes. The sound of Hartwell's skull cracking seemed to trigger something primal and savage in the drug-altered minds of everyone present. Martha Carver, despite being the bride, pulled a long-bladed knife from her wedding dress and drove it between Colonel Sinclair's ribs before he could fully comprehend what was happening. Her new husband staggered backward, clutching the wound as blood soaked through his dress uniform, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. Dr. Finch tried to flee toward the chamber's entrance, but Caleb and Abraham Carver caught him before he could escape. In their drug-fueled paranoia, they believed he was rushing to alert authorities about the ritual. Caleb wrapped his massive hands around the doctor's throat while Abraham struck him repeatedly with a brass oil lamp until the physician's struggles ceased. Colonel Sinclair, mortally wounded, but still alive, managed to draw his sword in a desperate attempt at self-defense. The blade caught Judith Carver across her arm as she lunged toward him, opening a deep gash that sprayed blood across the stone walls. Her scream of pain and rage seemed to energize the other siblings, who converged on the dying Confederate officer, like wolves attacking wounded prey. The underground chamber became a scene of indescribable carnage. Blood splattered the ancient symbols carved into the walls, and the scent of death mixed with the smoke from dozens of still burning candles. The drug continued to pulse through their systems, making the violence feel both intensely real and surreal, like a waking nightmare that none of them could escape. Ezekiel Carver, the family patriarch who had orchestrated this entire evening, found himself losing control of both his siblings and his own actions. The mountain wine that was supposed to ensure family loyalty had instead unleashed their darkest impulses. As he watched his carefully planned ritual dissolve into mass murder, he realized that some forces once released could never be contained. Again, what do you think drove this family to such extreme violence? Was it just the drugs, or something darker in their nature? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you're enjoying this disturbing piece of hidden American history. The massacre continued until 4 people lay dead on the cold stone floor, their blood mixing in dark pools that reflected the dancing candlelight. But the night's horrors were far from over, and the surviving Carvers would soon discover that covering up multiple murders during wartime required even more desperate measures. Dawn broke over the West Virginia mountains to reveal a scene that would challenge even the Carver family's considerable experience with violence and deception. 4 corpses lay in their underground ritual chamber, surrounded by evidence of drug use and savage brutality that could never be explained away as a simple accident or self-defense. The surviving family members, their minds still clouded by the lingering effects of the mountain wine, faced the enormous task of concealing what had happened. Ezekiel Carver, despite his own participation in the carnage, quickly took charge of the situation with the cold calculation that had made him successful in their criminal enterprises. The first priority was disposing of the bodies in a way that would prevent discovery and identification. The family's extensive knowledge of the local cave systems and abandoned mine shafts provided several options, but they needed to act quickly, before anyone came looking for the missing men. Dr. Finch's medical bag proved ironically useful in their cleanup efforts. The deceased physician had brought various chemicals and tools that the family used to accelerate decomposition and make identification of the remains more difficult. They also had access to quicklime from their legitimate limestone quarrying operations, which could dissolve organic matter and destroy evidence of their crimes. Colonel Sinclair's military status presented the greatest challenge. His absence would quickly be noticed by his regiment, and military investigators tended to be more thorough and persistent than local civilian authorities. The Carvers decided to stage evidence suggesting that Sinclair had deserted his post to join his new wife in fleeing to Mexico. A plausible scenario, given the increasing number of Confederate officers who were abandoning the failing war effort. Martha Carver, despite having murdered her husband on their wedding night, proved remarkably effective at playing the role of abandoned bride. She claimed that Sinclair had received urgent orders during the night and departed before dawn, taking several valuable items and promising to send for her once he had established himself in a new location. Her performance was so convincing that even some family members began to believe the fabricated story. The cleanup operation took 3 full days and nights. The underground chamber was scrubbed clean and the walls repainted to cover any blood stains that couldn't be removed. The ritual table was broken apart and burned, while the carved symbols on the walls were chiseled away and replaced with innocuous decorative patterns. Even the silver cups used in the ceremony were melted down and reformed to eliminate any trace of their original purpose. But physical evidence was only part of the problem. The surviving participants in the ritual, the remaining family members, and a few trusted associates, all carried psychological scars and fragmented memories of that horrific night. The mountain wine had created gaps in their recollections, making it difficult to establish exactly what had happened and in what order. These memory lapses, while helpful in some ways, also created inconsistencies in their stories that could potentially expose them to suspicion. Decades later, something shocking will be discovered in those same mountains that will prove the Carver family's crimes extended far beyond that single night. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. In the months following the wedding night massacre, the Carver family's criminal empire began to show signs of strain and internal corruption. The psychological trauma of what they had done, combined with the constant fear of discovery, created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and paranoia that infected every aspect of their operations. Trust, which had never been abundant among the siblings, became virtually non-existent. Jeremiah Carver, who had struck the first deadly blow against Thomas Hartwell, experienced the most severe psychological effects. He began suffering from violent nightmares and waking hallucinations that made him increasingly unpredictable and dangerous, even to his own family members. His brothers noticed that he would sometimes stare at his hands for hours, seemingly transfixed by memories of the blood he had spilled. During business meetings, he would suddenly become agitated and aggressive, accusing partners and customers of being federal spies or Confederate deserters. Martha Carver dealt with her trauma in a different but equally destructive way. She became obsessed with the idea that her murdered husband's ghost was haunting the family compound, and she began performing bizarre rituals intended to appease his spirit. These ceremonies, which she conducted in secret, involved burning Colonel Sinclair's personal effects and leaving food offerings in locations where she claimed to have seen his apparition. The family's business operations also suffered as their paranoia increased. They began refusing profitable contracts because they suspected potential customers of being undercover investigators. Their network of informants and bribed officials started to collapse as the Carvers became increasingly unwilling to trust anyone outside their immediate family. Several long-term business relationships ended abruptly when the siblings accused their partners of plotting against them. By the spring of 1864, the family's financial situation had deteriorated significantly. The Civil War was entering its final phase, and demand for smuggled weapons was declining as both armies faced defeat or victory. The Carvers found themselves sitting on large stockpiles of ammunition and firearms that were becoming increasingly difficult to sell. Their legitimate timber business was also struggling as military contracts were canceled and civilian construction projects were postponed. But their most serious problem was the growing attention from federal authorities. The disappearance of Thomas Hartwell, the federal arms inspector who had been taking bribes from the family, had triggered an investigation by Union intelligence officers. While the Carvers had successfully concealed the evidence of his murder, they couldn't prevent investigators from tracing his financial records and discovering his connection to their operations. The investigation into Thomas Hartwell's disappearance was led by Captain William Sterling, a former Philadelphia police detective who had joined Union intelligence services at the outbreak of the war. Sterling was known for his methodical approach in relentless pursuit of evidence, qualities that made him particularly dangerous to criminal organizations like the Carver family enterprise. Captain Sterling's investigation began with Hartwell's financial records, which revealed a pattern of unexplained income that far exceeded his government salary. Bank deposits and expenditures showed clear evidence of bribery and corruption, and the timing of these transactions correlated with known illegal arms shipments throughout the region. The trail led Sterling to focus his attention on several families and businesses in the West Virginia mountains, with the Carvers near the top of his list of suspects. The captain's arrival in Pocahontas County in June 1864 sent waves of panic through the Carver compound. His official credentials gave him authority to question witnesses, examine financial records, and search properties suspected of harboring contraband, unlike local law enforcement officials who could be bribed or intimidated. Sterling represented federal power that the family couldn't easily corrupt or eliminate. Ezekiel Carver met with Sterling twice during the initial phase of the investigation. The family patriarch presented himself as a respectable businessman who had occasionally purchased surplus military equipment through legal channels. He expressed surprise and concern about Hartwell's disappearance, claiming that the federal inspector had seemed nervous and distracted during their last meeting several months earlier. But Sterling was experienced enough to recognize evasion and deception. He noted inconsistencies in the family's stories about their business operations and observed the signs of stress and paranoia that marked guilty individuals. The captain also discovered that several other federal employees who had worked with Hartwell had received warnings about investigating the Carver family, suggestions that usually came with implicit or explicit threats. The investigation intensified when Sterling learned about Colonel Sinclair's alleged desertion and marriage to Martha Carver. The timing of the Confederate officer's disappearance occurring just hours after the Hartwell's last known location seemed too coincidental to ignore. When Sterling attempted to interview Martha about her missing husband, her nervous behavior and inconsistent answers only strengthened his suspicions. As the summer of 1864 progressed, Captain Sterling assembled a disturbing picture of the Carver family's criminal activities. While he still lacked direct evidence of murder, he had documented extensive proof of weapons smuggling, bribery of federal officials, and collaboration with enemy forces. The investigation was building toward arrest, warrants that would destroy the family's empire and likely result in execution for treason during wartime. The Carvers realized that their situation was becoming desperate. They had survived the immediate aftermath of their wedding night massacre, but the federal investigation threatened to expose not just their current crimes, but potentially uncover evidence of the murders they had committed. Drastic action would be necessary if they hoped to escape justice and preserve their freedom. Faced with imminent exposure and arrest, the Carver family made a decision that would seal their fate and ensure their story became legend rather than historical fact. In August 1864, as Captain Sterling prepared to execute federal arrest warrants against all 9 siblings, the family initiated a plan that they called their Final Covenant, a desperate gamble that would either secure their escape or result in their complete destruction. The plan centered around a massive explosion that would destroy all evidence of their crimes while creating the appearance that they had died in an accidental detonation of their ammunition stockpiles. The family had access to large quantities of black powder and other explosives through their smuggling operations, and they possessed detailed knowledge of their underground storage facilities that could make such an explosion seem plausible. But the Carvers didn't intend to actually die in the explosion. Instead, they planned to use the blast as cover for their escape to Mexico, where several Confederate officers and Southern sympathizers had already fled to avoid prosecution. They had been secretly transferring money and valuable items to hidden locations throughout the summer, preparing for the possibility that they might need to abandon their mountain empire entirely. The preparation for their final gambit revealed the full extent of the psychological damage that the wedding night massacre had inflicted on the family. Jeremiah Carver insisted on returning to the underground ritual chamber one last time, claiming that he needed to complete the covenant with the spirits of their victims. His siblings tried to dissuade him, but his violent tendencies made them afraid to oppose him directly. On the night of August 15, 1864, Jeremiah disappeared into the caves beneath the family compound. When he failed to return by morning, his Brothers went searching for him and made a discovery that horrified even their hardened sensibilities. Jeremiah had apparently suffered a complete mental breakdown and had used his knife to carve the names of their murder victims into his own chest and arms. He was found dead in the ritual chamber, surrounded by candles and the remnants of their mountain wine mixture. The discovery of Jeremiah's body forced the family to accelerate their escape plan. They could no longer afford to wait for the perfect moment or ensure that every detail was properly arranged. Captain Sterling's investigation was closing in, and they had lost one of their most dangerous, but also most committed family members. The explosion that would cover their tracks needed to happen immediately before federal agents could search the underground chambers and potentially discover evidence of their crimes. Ezekiel, Martha, and the remaining siblings gathered for what they believed would be their final night in the mountains that had been their home for generations. But as they prepared to detonate the explosives that would erase their past, they discovered that some secrets are too terrible to bury and some sins too great to escape. On the night of August 16, 1864, residents throughout the Pocahontas County region were awakened by an explosion so powerful that it shattered windows over 5 miles away and was heard as far as Virginia. The Carver family compound, along with most of their underground storage facilities, was completely destroyed in a blast that sent flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air and left a crater where their main house had once stood. Captain Sterling and his team of federal investigators rushed to the scene at first light, expecting to find the smoldering ruins of a successful criminal enterprise and possibly the bodies of their primary suspects. What they discovered instead was evidence of a tragedy far more complex and disturbing than they had anticipated. The explosion had indeed destroyed most of the physical evidence that could have proven the family's crimes, but it had also exposed sections of the underground chambers that had previously been hidden. In these exposed areas, Sterling's team found human bones that appeared to have been buried long before the explosion occurred. The remains showed signs of violence, cracked skulls, broken ribs, and knife marks that suggested these individuals had died brutally and been hastily concealed. Most shocking of all was the discovery of Jeremiah Carver's body in what appeared to be a ritual chamber deep beneath the original house. The elaborate carvings on his body, combined with the occult symbols still visible on the chamber walls, suggested that the family had been involved in practices far more sinister than simple arms smuggling and bribery. Sterling realized that he was looking at evidence of systematic murder and possibly cannibalistic rituals that had been conducted over many years. But, despite these disturbing discoveries, no bodies of the other Carver siblings were found in the ruins. The explosion pattern and distribution of debris suggested that the blast had been carefully planned and executed by someone with extensive knowledge of explosives and structural engineering. Sterling began to suspect that the family had faked their own deaths and successfully escaped, leaving behind only their most unstable member and a selection of their victims' remains. The investigation continued for several months, but without living suspects to arrest or clear evidence linking the discovered remains to specific crimes. The case eventually stalled. The federal government was more concerned with winning the war and rebuilding the nation than pursuing a family of criminals who appeared to be dead. The official report classified the explosion as an accidental detonation of illegally stored ammunition, with the Carver family listed as casualties rather than suspects. Local residents, however, refused to accept the official explanation. Stories began circulating about strange lights seen in the mountains, unexplained sounds echoing from the ruins, and travelers who reported being watched by unseen observers along the old smuggling routes. The Carver name became synonymous with evil and corruption, a cautionary tale told to children about the consequences of greed and moral compromise. What Captain Sterling and his investigators never discovered was that 5 of the 9 Carver siblings had indeed survived the explosion and successfully escaped to Mexico as planned. Martha, Rebecca, Judith, Sarah and Abraham had reached the border within days of the blast and established new identities using forged papers and hidden assets they had accumulated over the years. But their escape from justice did not mean escape from the psychological trauma of their crimes. The surviving siblings found it impossible to trust one another, and their partnership quickly dissolved into suspicion and betrayal. Within 2 years of reaching Mexico, Sarah Carver had been found dead in her hotel room, apparently poisoned by an unknown assailant. Rebecca disappeared while traveling to California and was never seen again. Martha Carver, perhaps driven by guilt over murdering her husband, became increasingly religious and spent her final years in a Mexican convent, claiming to seek redemption for unnamed sins. She died in 1889, reportedly still suffering from nightmares about her wedding night. Judith managed to establish a successful business in Texas under an assumed name, but she never married or had children, and neighbors reported that she would sometimes scream in her sleep about blood and candles. Only Abraham Carver seemed to successfully adapt to his new life. He moved to Arizona Territory and became a prosperous rancher, eventually serving as a territorial legislator and respected community leader. But even Abraham carried the weight of his family's crimes. In his private papers discovered after his death in 1904, he wrote extensively about his guilt and his belief that the Carver family had been cursed by the innocent blood they had spilled. The most disturbing aspect of Abraham's writings was his claim that the wedding night massacre had not been an isolated incident. According to his journal, the family had performed their sacred covenant ritual multiple times over the years, and it had always resulted in violence and death. The underground chambers beneath their compound contained the remains of at least 15 people who had been murdered during these drug-fueled ceremonies, including business partners, potential witnesses, and even family members who had threatened to expose their crimes. Abraham's journals also suggested that similar rituals were being practiced by other criminal families. Throughout the Appalachian region during the Civil War era, the breakdown of law and order, combined with the availability of opium and other drugs through medical and military channels, had created conditions where such practices could flourish in isolated communities. The Carver family may have been particularly violent and successful, but they were apparently not unique in their methods or their madness. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the West Virginia mountains intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The story of the Carver family might have remained buried in forgotten archives and sealed government files, but in 1923, a coal mining operation in Pocahontas County made a discovery that brought their crimes back to public attention. Workers excavating a new mine shaft uncovered a section of the old Carver underground chambers that had somehow survived both the 1864 explosion and nearly 60 years of natural decay. Inside this preserved chamber, investigators found a collection of items that provided chilling confirmation of Abraham Carver's written confessions. Human bones bearing clear signs of violence were scattered throughout the room, along with the remnants of ritual implements, drug preparation equipment, and carved symbols that matched descriptions from the federal investigation. Most significantly, they discovered a metal lockbox containing detailed records of the family's criminal activities, including a list of victims and dates that corresponded to their sacred covenant ceremonies. The discovery attracted national attention and prompted a renewed investigation by state authorities. Newspaper headlines across the country proclaimed the find as evidence of America's most evil family and the mountain devils of West Virginia. The story captured public imagination during the Roaring Twenties, a time when Americans were fascinated by tales of crime and moral corruption from their nation's past. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the 1923 discovery was the evidence it provided about the scope of the Carver family's influence. Documents found in the lockbox showed that their criminal network had extended far beyond simple arms smuggling and had included human trafficking, organized murder, and what appeared to be the systematic corruption of government officials throughout multiple states. Letters and financial records suggested that the Carvers had been part of a larger criminal organization that operated throughout the Appalachian region during the Civil War era. This network used drug-fueled rituals similar to the Sacred Covenant to ensure loyalty and eliminate potential witnesses. The Wedding Night Massacre of 1863 was apparently just one incident in a pattern of ritualistic violence that had been practiced by multiple families across several states. State investigators attempted to trace the surviving members of the network, but most of the evidence was too old to pursue legally. However, they did discover that several prominent families in Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee had histories that included unexplained disappearances, mysterious accidents, and sudden changes in fortune during the 1860s. While they couldn't prove criminal activity, the patterns were remarkably similar to the Carver family's documented crimes. The investigation also revealed that some descendants of these criminal families had achieved positions of significant political and economic influence in their respective states. While there was no evidence that these descendants were aware of their family's historical crimes, the investigators noted that several had opposed efforts to preserve historical records from the Civil War era or to investigate cold cases from that period. In 1952, the last piece of the Carver family puzzle fell into place when Mexican authorities contacted American law enforcement about a deathbed confession from an elderly woman named Maria Esperanza. The woman, who was dying in a Mexico City hospital, claimed to have information about American criminals who had fled to Mexico after the Civil War. Maria's story revealed that she had been employed as a housekeeper for Martha Carver during the former Carver sisters' final years in the Mexican convent. Martha had apparently been tormented by guilt and had confessed the complete truth about her family's crimes to Maria in the months before her death. According to Maria's testimony, Martha had described in detail the Wedding Night Massacre and had claimed that it was only one of many similar incidents. Most shocking of all, Martha had allegedly told Maria that the Sacred Covenant ritual had been learned from a traveling occultist who claimed it would give practitioners power over life and death. This individual, whose name Martha couldn't remember, had visited several mountain communities during the 1850s and had taught the ritual to families who were willing to pay for his knowledge. The drug mixture and ceremonial procedures were apparently variations of practices he had observed during travels in Europe and Asia. Martha's confession, as related by Maria, also provided details about the fate of the other surviving Carver siblings. According to her account, Rebecca had been murdered by Judith in a dispute over hidden money, while Sarah had been poisoned by Abraham when she threatened to return to the United States and confess their crimes. The family's paranoia and mutual distrust had ultimately led them to destroy each other, even after escaping justice. The Mexican authorities provided American investigators with Maria's written statement and several items that she claimed Martha had given her, including a silver locket containing photographs of the 9 Carver siblings and what appeared to be a dried sample of the mountain wine mixture used in their rituals. Chemical analysis of the sample confirmed the presence of opium, hallucinogenic compounds, and several other substances that would have produced the psychological effects described by witnesses. Today, the Carver family compound site in West Virginia is marked only by a small historical plaque that makes no mention of the crimes committed there. The official designation describes it as the location of a tragic explosion during the Civil War and notes that it serves as a reminder of the dangers faced by civilians during wartime. Local historians have repeatedly petitioned to have the plaque updated to reflect the true nature of what happened there, but state officials have consistently refused, claiming that the evidence is too circumstantial and the events too disturbing for public commemoration. The reluctance to acknowledge the full truth about the Carver family may stem from more than simple bureaucratic caution. Research conducted in the 1970s by Dr. Elanina Pemberton, a criminologist at West Virginia University, suggested that the influence of families like the Carvers extended well beyond their immediate criminal activities. Her work documented a network of corruption and violence that involved prominent political and business leaders throughout the region, many of whose descendants still hold positions of power and influence. Dr. Petton's research was abruptly terminated when she received threats against her family and her university funding was mysteriously withdrawn. Her partially completed manuscript, which was donated to the university archives after her death in 1995, paints a picture of systematic cover-ups and deliberate historical revisionism designed to protect the reputations of families whose fortunes were built on Civil War-era crimes. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Petton's research was her discovery of similar ritual sites throughout the Appalachian region. Using archaeological techniques and ground-penetrating radar, she identified at least 12 locations in 4 states, where underground chambers contained evidence of organized violence and drug-fueled ceremonies. Many of these sites were located beneath the former properties of families that had achieved significant wealth and political power during the Civil War era. The pattern was consistent across all the sites: underground chambers carved into hillsides or basement, ritual implements, and drug preparation equipment. Human remains showing signs of violence and evidence of systematic concealment and cover-up. Dr. Petton theorized that the Sacred Covenant ritual, or variations of it, had been practiced by a network of criminal families who used the chaos of the Civil War to eliminate rivals, silence witnesses, and expand their illegal enterprises. Her research also uncovered evidence that some of these families had maintained contact with each other well into the 20th century. Business partnerships, intermarriages, and political alliances seemed to follow patterns that suggested ongoing coordination and mutual protection. While she couldn't prove active criminal conspiracy among modern descendants, the statistical likelihood of so many coincidental connections was virtually zero. The influence of the Carver family's criminal methods extended well beyond their immediate operations in West Virginia and the American Southwest. By the 1890s, territorial law enforcement officials began documenting similar patterns of ritualistic violence and systematic corruption in criminal organizations throughout the western United States. While direct connections to the Carver family couldn't always be proven, the similarities in methods and philosophy suggested that their techniques had spread far beyond their original practitioners. Detective William Hayes of the Territorial Police in New Mexico compiled extensive reports between 1887 and 1894, detailing criminal organizations that used rouge-induced rituals to maintain loyalty and eliminate witnesses. His investigations revealed at least 6 separate groups operating in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona that practiced variations of what Hayes termed covenant ceremonies, remarkably similar to the Sacred Covenant described in the Carver family records. Hayes's reports filed with territorial authorities and later transferred to state archives documented a troubling evolution in American organized crime. The chaotic conditions of the Civil War era had allowed criminal families like the Carvers to experiment with new methods of control and intimidation. As the frontier expanded westward, these methods spread with the migrants and criminals who carried them into new territories. The detective's most detailed case study involved the Brennan family of Colorado, who controlled silver mining operations through a combination of legitimate business practices and systematic murder. According to Hayes's investigation, the family had learned their methods from a mysterious individual who claimed to have worked with mountain families during the Civil War. The Brennan ceremonies involved drug mixtures nearly identical to those used by the Carvers, and their victims showed similar patterns of ritualistic violence. Hayes's investigation came to an abrupt end in 1895 when he was found dead in his hotel room in Santa Fe, apparently having consumed a fatal dose of laudanum. The official investigation ruled his death a suicide, noting that he had been under considerable stress due to his dangerous work and family financial problems. However, colleagues noted that Hayes had seemed optimistic about his cases in their last conversations and had made plans for future investigations that suggested no intention of self-harm. The detectives' files were confiscated by territorial authorities and classified as part of ongoing criminal investigations. When New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, many of these files were reportedly destroyed in a clerical reorganization, though some historians suspect they were deliberately eliminated to protect individuals and families who had achieved prominent positions in the new state government. As we near the end of this dark chapter in American history, several crucial questions remain unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable given the systematic suppression of evidence over the past century and a half. The most fundamental question is whether the Carver family was an isolated case of Civil War-era criminality or part of a larger network that may have evolved into something resembling organized crime in the modern sense. The evidence suggests that families like the Carvers were more common than historians have generally acknowledged. The chaos and breakdown of legal authority during the Civil War created opportunities for criminal enterprises that might not have been possible during peacetime. The availability of weapons, drugs, and desperate people created perfect conditions for the kind of exploitation and violence that the Carvers specialized in. But what makes the Carver story particularly disturbing is the evidence that their methods and philosophy may have been passed down to subsequent generations. The ritual aspects of their crimes, combined with the systematic elimination of witnesses and the cultivation of corrupt officials, represent a level of criminal sophistication that was remarkable for its time and terrifying in its implications. If families like the Carvers did indeed form networks of mutual support and protection, and if those networks survived into the modern era, then many aspects of American political and economic history would need to be the fortunes that were built during the Civil War era, the political dynasties that emerged from that period, and the patterns of power and influence that continue to shape American society today, might all have darker origins than we have been taught to believe. The systematic suppression of this history suggests that someone believes these questions are worth killing to keep unanswered. The deaths and intimidation of researchers, the disappearance of evidence, and the official denials all point to ongoing efforts to protect secrets that are now more than 150 years old. Such persistence in covering up historical crimes implies that the implications of those crimes are not merely historical. In 1889, 25 years after the explosion that destroyed the Carver compound, a dying man arrived at a Catholic mission in El Paso, Texas, carrying with him the final piece of the family's dark puzzle. Father Miguel Rodriguez, the mission priest, recorded the man's deathbed confession in his personal journal, which was discovered decades later in the mission archives. The dying man identified himself as Thomas Hartwell, Jr., son of the federal arms inspector who had been murdered during the Wedding Night Massacre. According to his confession, he had spent most of his adult life tracking down the surviving Carver siblings and documenting their continued crimes throughout the American Southwest. His investigation had revealed that Abraham Carver's reputation as a reformed family member was entirely false. Instead of abandoning the family's criminal traditions, Abraham had established an even more sophisticated operation in Arizona Territory, using the lessons learned from his family's Civil War experiences. He had created a network of associates who practiced variations of the Sacred Covenant ritual to maintain loyalty and eliminate threats. The ritual had evolved from its original form but retained the same core elements: drug-induced altered states, ritualistic violence, and systematic murder of potential witnesses. Young Hartwell's confession provided detailed accounts of at least 8 separate incidents between 1867 and 1885, where Abraham Carver's organization had used ritual murder to expand their criminal enterprises. The victims included rival businessmen, territorial officials who couldn't be bribed, and even members of Abraham's own organization who had shown signs of disloyalty or weakness. Each murder was carefully staged to appear accidental or to implicate innocent parties. Most disturbing of all, Hartwell claimed that Abraham had taught the sacred covenant ritual to criminal families throughout the territories, creating a network of like-minded organizations that protected each other and shared information about potential threats. The Wedding Night Massacre of 1863 had not been the end of the Carver family's influence, but the beginning of something far more widespread and dangerous. Father Rodriguez's journal recorded that Hartwell died peacefully after making his confession, apparently relieved to finally share the burden of knowledge that had consumed his life. The priest noted that Hartwell carried with him a leather satchel containing documents, photographs, and what appeared to be samples of the drug mixture used in the Carver rituals. However, the journal indicates that these materials were destroyed in a mission fire just days after Hartwell's death. Whether the fire was accidental or deliberately set to prevent the evidence from being discovered remained unclear. But Father Rodriguez noted in his final entry about the incident that he had observed strange men asking questions about Hartwell in the days before the blaze occurred. The story of the Carver family and their disturbing wedding night tradition remains buried in the archives of history, a dark chapter that few historians dare to examine closely. The last confirmed sighting of any surviving Carver family member occurred in 1891, when a woman matching Martha Carver's description was reportedly seen entering a convent in Guadalajara, Mexico, carrying only a small bag and refusing to speak her real name. By 1895, all traces of the surviving Carver siblings had vanished from historical records. Abraham Carver's legitimate business interests in Arizona were quietly sold to anonymous buyers, while his illegitimate enterprises seemed to simply disappear without explanation. The territorial authorities who had once been in his pocket either died in apparent accidents or left the region suddenly, taking their secrets with them. The Wedding Night Massacre in the West Virginia mountains had claimed for immediate victims, but its true death toll may never be known. If Thomas Hartwell Jr., his deathbed confession is to be believed, the Sacred Covenant ritual claimed dozens of additional victims over the following 3 decades, and the criminal network established by the Carver family continued to operate long after the original perpetrators had died or disappeared. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that the Carver family's methods, the systematic use of drugs to control behavior, ritualistic violence to enforce loyalty, and the cultivation of corrupt officials to avoid prosecution, represented a level of criminal sophistication that was far ahead of its time. Their techniques would not seem out of place in organized crime families of later eras, suggesting that the Carvers may have been pioneers in methods that would eventually become standard practice among American criminal organizations. The underground chambers beneath their West Virginia compound were sealed permanently after the 1923 archaeological investigation, but the ideas and techniques developed there may have found new applications in countless other locations throughout the expanding American frontier. The Sacred Covenant ritual, with its combination of psychological manipulation and deadly violence, proved to be a remarkably effective method for maintaining criminal organizations and eliminating threats. Local residents in the areas where the Carver family operated have passed down stories and warnings through generations, creating a folklore of evil that serves as both entertainment and cautionary tale. Children in West Virginia, Arizona, and parts of Texas still learn songs and rhymes that reference the Carver curse and the wedding night that never ends, though most no longer understand the historical origins of these cultural traditions. The physical evidence of the Carver family's crimes has been destroyed, scattered, or deliberately hidden, but their legacy persists in the form of techniques, traditions, and networks that they established during their years of operation. The Wedding Night Massacre of 1863 was both the climax and the beginning of a story that continued to unfold for decades afterward. touching the lives of countless individuals who never knew they were connected to that original night of horror. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Carver name faded from public memory, becoming just another forgotten footnote in the complex and often violent history of the American Civil War era. But for those who knew where to look and what questions to ask, the influence of that terrible family could still be traced in the patterns of corruption, violence, and ritualistic behavior that characterized certain criminal organizations throughout the American West and Southwest. The sacred covenant that bound the 9 Carver siblings in loyalty and mutual destruction may have died with them, but the methods and philosophy behind it lived on in new forms and new practitioners. The wedding night tradition that began as a family ritual became a template for criminal behavior that would influence American organized crime for generations to come. This mystery shows us how easily evil can hide behind respectability, and how effectively the powerful can corrupt entire communities to protect their secrets. The Carver family story reminds us that some of American history's darkest chapters remain unwritten, buried beneath layers of deliberate forgetting and institutional silence. What do you think of this story? Do you believe such organized evil could have operated so successfully in 19th century America? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale of historical horror, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates the darker truths of our nation's past. The dead may be silent, but their stories refuse to stay buried forever.